Nick, it's finally here, bro. I hope you watch this. Nick Bracing 8786. So Nick left a comment on our video about does the Old Testament condone slavery? And in that video, Andrew and I addressed indentured servitude slavery, but Nick brought up, rightfully so, the point that we didn't really address the slavery regulations for non-Israelites. So we had a big back and forth, and then
I want to read Nick's comment. So Nick said this: You go on to say that Christians were the first people to end slavery in history, and this is simply not true at all. Solon abolished debt slavery in Athens in the early 6th century BC. Wang Mang abolished slavery in China in 9 to 12 AD. The Haitian Revolution ended slavery in 1804.
Got you. So you're right. Christians aren't the first to ever abolish slavery in the history of the world. So what we should have been more clear on is that Christian abolitionists were the first people in history on that wide of a scale to abolish it based on an objective moral standard that it was wrong from a religious perspective.
Right.
So we apologize for not being super clear on that, but I did want to take a couple things of what you said. Solon abolished slavery strictly for the purposes of debt. It wasn't for any type of human rights issue or anything like that. Solon didn't appeal to some.
It wasn't because people were made in the image.
It wasn't because people were made in the image of God. Exactly. It was to help. And Wang Mang abolished slavery in China. And I forget which one that you noted, Nick, that had all the regulations, because the Old Testament was the first one to regulate slavery in the sense that it gave slaves any rights at all. Mm-hmm. The regulations from that one, from the other one, not the Bible one, but the other one that you mentioned, were all for the slave owners themselves in relation to other slave owners and how they were to deal financially with them. It had monetary regulations. It didn't have any type of human rights regulations. So, yeah, I think the bigger point we were making was that, like I just said, Christian abolitionists were the first to do it on the scale that they did and do it because of the image of God. And let me just say this, Nick. Andrew and I both appeal to, we think the Bible clearly teaches progressive revelation, and you said that just falls flat to you. A, I would ask you, by what standard does it fall flat to your moral compass? And B, I would just say this.
Do you want to, and can you explain what you mean by progressive revelation?
Yeah, so God's full character and his full plan for humanity and his full, desires for how to live were not just stated in an instruction manual on page 1 of Genesis.
Yeah.
He worked throughout history through flawed, sinful humans and ultimately revealed more of himself and more of his plan throughout the Bible, throughout history. And I think the biggest example of that is Christ himself, right? Christ is the ultimate example of progressive revelation because you don't know the full revelation of God. And Jesus, and the Bible says that Jesus is the full revelation, that we have ultimately, that he's the exact imprint of his nature. And I would say this: if you want to get on slavery, and when you say that falls flat to you, that's what the Bible teaches. And I think and this is what I wanted to bring up to you, Nick, specifically, man. And I hope you hear this, bro. The best example that one of the most obvious examples that I see of progressive revelation is when Jesus is talking to the Pharisees and he's talking about divorce. And the Pharisees question him and they say, "You say that a man shall not divorce his wife, but Moses said that we could divorce our wives." I'm paraphrasing. Moses said we could divorce our wives.
Yeah.
And Jesus literally says, Moses said you could divorce because of your hardened hearts. And here's the key, Nick. He then goes to say, he says, but it was not that way in the beginning. So you have Jesus talking about the law of God, which he viewed as perfect, not necessarily being ideal from the way it was in the beginning or the way that it should be in the end. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah. And I think the verse that always brings that home for me is where Jesus says, "You have heard it said, but I say to you." What that means is that the Old Testament was not complete. You'll never hear me arguing that the Old Testament presents God's final objective morality.
Right. And it doesn't contradict. It doesn't contradict, but it's not a full. You haven't turned the lights in the room on fully, though.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. So the reason Jesus said, "You have heard it said, but I say to you," the Old Testament was moderating behavior with simple rules, where the New Testament was the full vision of what God expected for humanity. And so so when we talk about God's objective morality, we're talking about the standard of Jesus. And so when Sure, we can go to the Old Testament and say, oh, well, there's some things in here that aren't quite perfect and seem to have changed from the New Testament. It's not that things changed. It's that God didn't have to reveal his complete plan in the Old Testament.
Right.
And that's what's meant by progressive revelation. God didn't tell the children of Israel everything. His complete actual will was not revealed until Jesus
the
came.
gospel wasn't revealed in its fullness until Christ himself. So, and also Nick, you mentioned that the book of Philemon confused you, and you basically compared Philemon to a runaway slave, to Onesimus. I'm sorry, man, that's not correct. There's a reason that Paul says to him, anything that he owes you, charge it to my account. Because what had almost certainly happened, because what was very commonplace in that time is Philemon would have almost certainly sold himself to Onesimus to be housed, to be taken care of, to be fed, and then he would have run away. And even in some people even think that maybe he stole from Onesimus as well. Otherwise, again, you wouldn't have Paul saying, if anything, he owes you. And then again, the first ancient document in history where Paul says, even more than a slave, he's much more a brother in the Lord. You have no other reference point to say from any other script, any other document in history where you have someone comparing a slave and a slave master equally in the eyes of the divine. It doesn't exist outside the Bible, man. So God planned, all in essence, whether this falls flat to you or not, and again, by what standard does it fall flat morally to you? But no matter what, God planted the seeds throughout history that would ultimately lead to the biggest abolitionist movement that helped end the majority of slavery in the known world, in the West at least, that we've ever seen in history. And you don't get that without Christianity.
Yeah.
But you don't get a justification for it, an ultimate justification for it, because you don't get the Imago Dei.
Yeah. And just to come back to that, irrefutably, it was Christianity that ended the transatlantic slave trade. It ended it in Britain.
And slaves too, non-Christian slaves too. He said that, and he's right about that. But and real quick, almost every slave rebellion throughout history always collapsed, and they were slaughtered unless they had people that were part of the non-slave class on their side as well. So yes, slaves that were not necessarily Christians absolutely contributed to the abolition of slavery, but it would not have happened if you didn't have half the country abolishing it with them. And I would just say this too, Nick. I would just say this to anybody who says the Bible condones slavery. Let me ask you a question.
Oh, hang on. We'll get to that in the next one. That's in the next one.
Okay.
But yeah, so yeah, it was Christianity, not. Here's kind of what I wrote down. It was Christianity, not humanism, not atheism, that led to the end of the transatlantic slave trade.
Yeah, what's wrong with slavery on humanism?
Yeah. So Toussaint Louverture was a Christian, and he was one of the leaders and the captains who ended slavery.
John
in Haiti.
Woolman, yeah.
It was Christians quoting the Bible that ended the transatlantic slave trade. John Wesley preached against slavery his whole life. Spurgeon preached against slavery and racism his whole life. Christians in Britain, led by William Wilberforce, and later Christians in America,
that's what I was thinking of, yeah.
Led by Abraham Lincoln. But yes, it was Christians. It was Christians who ended the transatlantic slave trade. So we'll be interested to hear your response.